Hi, Acadiana. I'm Meteorologist Dave Baker with a look at the latest on Hurricane Rafael on this Wednesday afternoon. Still a major hurricane. It was upgraded to a Category 3 earlier this afternoon, and it's maintaining as it gets a little bit closer to the Cuban coastline. It will be making landfall, crossing over, and then emerging into the Gulf of Mexico. Latest coordinates there on the left-hand side of your screen, and also the rain chances are going to start to drop off here a little bit as we go into Thursday, which is your forecast there also on the left-hand side of your screen. Real quick, I did want to show you the radar currently as we're still looking at some pretty hefty rainfall, especially over the western sections. We've just got this front that doesn't want to go away. It's stalled over the central part of Acadiana and a lot of the rain out toward the west, and that hopefully will start to taper off as we go into Thursday. So let's go ahead and get into the tropical weather outlook. Not only do we have Rafael, but we've also got another little tropical wave or an area of disturbed weather northeast of the Leeward and Windward Islands that could possibly get a chance for some development. Some of the models are indicating some development, but right now the National Hurricane Center is showing a low chance. A couple of players that are involved with the steering of Rafael is first you've got a trough that's out here in the west, but I don't think that's really going to get a chance to pick it up as that's going to get cut off over the Four Corners states and not really move a whole lot. I think the big player is going to be more of a ridge of high pressure that's over the Atlantic that's actually going to start to drift a little bit farther toward the west, and that should be able to push Rafael on more of a westward track, which is actually good news as earlier runs of the models were trying to bring Rafael a little closer to the northern Gulf Coast, not as a major hurricane. It would see significant weakening if it were to make it to the northern Gulf Coast, but as of right now, it looks like it might be drifting a little bit more off toward the west and staying well offshore of Louisiana. The bad news is, as the farther south the hurricane stays, the better of a chance it's going to have to maintain that hurricane or even strong tropical storm status because it would be staying away from the cooler waters as well as the wind shear that's going to be over the northern Gulf Coast later this weekend and early next week. So even though it's good news for us that it won't be heading in our direction, it could be bad news for friends that are out maybe in the middle part of the Gulf of Mexico or especially along the Mexican coast here over the next several days. Something to really watch out for. But the Caribbean is now watching Rafael kind of move off toward the northwest, and it is crossing over the western tip of Cuba. You can see there's a little bit more of an eye wall kind of showing up there for a while. But now that it's getting closer to land, kind of filling it a little bit. So we're going to see some weakening as it moves over land, but it's still going to emerge probably as a hurricane once it gets into the Gulf of Mexico. So this is the latest that we've got from the National Hurricane Center, and it is a new forecast track. And if you saw the 9 o'clock advisory early this morning, you saw that big circle there in the middle of the Gulf because what was left, or this weakened form of Rafael, could possibly become just a tropical storm. But then it's going to slow down as it kind of gets away from a lot of the steering currents. So that's why you're seeing more of that wider range. But notice that all of Louisiana is now no longer in the cone. This is a significant shift to the southwest, but they're north of the Yucatan Peninsula and they're just to the west of the Florida Keys. This is still going to be a significant hurricane. And earlier we showed some of these model tracks that were kind of trending more westward. There's still a couple of them that turn toward the Louisiana coastline, but the majority of the models are now on more of a westward track and even a little bit of a southern track back into the Bay of Campeche. Some of our hurricane-specific models were showing that trend earlier today and still are showing that trend this afternoon. The intensity models, though, of course, it is a Category 3 right now, and a lot of our intensity models are kind of holding this in a high-end Category 2, low-end Category 3 here for the next 48 to 60 hours. So you're talking about out 2.5 days, and then by the time you get to day 3 and day 4, you start to see the trends going down. Now, that wouldn't be a landfall. Again, that would be due to some cooler waters and probably some additional wind shear and even some dry air that's kind of forecast to be in the western part of the Gulf of Mexico as we go toward the latter part of the week. As far as any tropical storm force winds, we might see some of those in the offshore waters as it drifts off to the west. A lot of that is going to be dependent on how strong Rafael stays as it moves westward across the Gulf of Mexico. On land, I am not expecting any impacts from this at this point, but the offshore waters could be fairly choppy, and you'll probably see some minor coastal flooding. We've already seen some coastal flooding due to the trough out in the west and the frontal boundary that's been stalled. So having a hurricane push some water up toward the northern Gulf Coast could also cause some coastal flooding. So rough seas, maybe some coastal flooding, above normal tides possible. That would be the major impact for our local area. So let's go into the HWRF. This was the run this afternoon, and you can see it after it crosses Cuba, that high to the east really gives it a good push off toward the west and significant weakening. But notice you get even more of a turn there back to the south. And when we talk about a lot of these global and hurricane models, they don't have a whole lot of old data to work with because there aren't very many hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico during the month of November. Remember, even the models, just like what we're trying to do, we're trying to transition from summer through fall and then going into winter. But it just doesn't seem to be changing, and the model runs are also trying to think more on a winter type of scale, but even the hurricane models are having a bit of a difficult time with the forecast track and the intensity. Now the HAFS model also takes a track off toward the west, but notice how it considers it, keeps it relatively strong all the way up into a landfall there on the Mexican coast. So that's another scenario that we're possibly looking at here between now and the end of the weekend. So here's our global models. And again, remember, they don't have a lot to work with, so just like sometimes we have to do when there's just no model consistency, you kind of got to take your best guess, and you got to base it on a lot of stuff that we've seen in history, but we don't have a lot of cases to base our forecasts on during the month of November. But the GFS model shows a little bit more of a northward turn as the trough kind of opens up from the Four Corner states, but there's going to be a lot of wind shear, and you can see there is significant weakening. So even if the GFS is correct, that's about the closest it would be in 5 days. And then I think that trough is going to bypass it, and you would see the GFS model is suggesting beyond day 5 a little bit more of a southern movement. So out going to about Sunday, you get the hurricane or tropical storm to get about that close, and then it's going to weaken, and I think it's going to kind of drift off toward the west or down to the south as you get into days 6 and 7. So even though it looks a little ominous like it's coming toward Louisiana, the extended forecast actually starts to turn it more away. And you see that a little bit more here with the Euro. The Euro is picking it up a little bit faster, kind of pushing it off into the middle part of the Gulf of Mexico. And it stays relatively strong, and then it kind of stalls for a little bit before starting to shift its way off toward the southwest, which is a little closer to what we were seeing with the HAFS model, more of a turn toward the Bay of Campeche, but also keeping it quite strong. But our other couple of global models, the Canadian is still trying to have this picked up by a trough and then washed out and then zipped off toward the northeast, making a landfall on the Louisiana coast as a low-end tropical storm or maybe a tropical depression. Not anything that's going to be significant, but the Canadian model is still trying to hang on to a northern Gulf Coast strike, while the Icon model is kind of following the other ones. You get more of a stall there in the middle part of the Gulf of Mexico, and then it just kind of fizzles out there and eventually just dissipates. So that would be a good case scenario for everybody if we can get the wind shear to just tear it apart. So again, late this weekend, this is actually Sunday afternoon, GFS shows a low there south of the Louisiana coast, but that's as close as it's going to get according to this model. It will start to turn back toward the south. The Euro model has a much stronger system right over the central part of the Gulf of Mexico, but after day 5, it's also starting to trend a little bit more toward the southwest. The Canadian model is the only one that I've got on the global range here that's still pulling this off toward the Louisiana coast, but in a majorly weakened form. This is not going to be a hurricane, and if this were to verify, we're probably looking at a tropical depression. But since the other 3 models are really indicating either a low stalling in the central Gulf and drifting off toward the southwest, I think you can kind of rule out what the Canadian is saying right now. But the new Icon model is starting to come down, so we'll have a little bit more data later this afternoon. As far as its current track, the water temperatures are very high in the southeastern part of the Gulf of Mexico. So once it emerges emerges again into the Gulf. Right now it's over land, so we're not going to be seeing any strengthening, but it could maintain hurricane strength there, especially if it stays over the southern part of the Gulf of Mexico. And that tropical cyclone heat potential is still pretty high there off the northwestern coast of Cuba, and it stays like that. So if you get more of a westerly drift, you're probably going to be seeing a stronger system. If it starts to turn a little bit farther toward the north, it would be affected by not just the cooler waters and the lower heat potential, but it would also be dealing with quite a bit of wind shear. And there's already tons of wind shear here along the northern Gulf Coast, but where the hurricane is right now, there's still some fairly low wind shear. So it's got all the things going for it right now with the warm waters and the low wind shear. But if it moves into the northern part of the Gulf there, and especially even with the GFS that pulls it close to Louisiana and then eventually turns it back off toward the south, it would encounter some of that wind shear as it gets a little bit closer here to the northern Gulf Coast. So then it would be in a more weakened form again if it were to start to shift its way off toward the southwest. So we'll have to kind of wait and see, but the models are all trending, first of all, away from the northern Gulf Coast, more of a westerly track. So if it stays farther to the south, it's got a better chance of staying a stronger system. If it tends to pull more northward, then you're going to see a considerably weaker system. But right now, for the Acadiana region and really for the entire Gulf Coast, at this point, I don't see a threat coming with Hurricane Rafael anytime in the next several days, at least going through the weekend. The closest it would get would probably be on Sunday based on the models that we have right now. That's why we like to do this day after day after day to kind of see how the models trend in one direction or another, or intensify or start to see some weakening in there. So the more model data that you have and the more runs that you look at, the better your forecast can be. But at this point in time, day 1, 2, and 3, pretty certain what's going to happen. But after day 4, all of the models are all over the place. So this is, again, it's kind of a difficult forecast for that extended. But for right now, I wouldn't be worried about this coming toward us. Or if it did come toward us, it would not be a hurricane. It would be a very, very weak system, maybe just a tropical depression or even less. So that's what I've got for you on this Wednesday afternoon. Of course, please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and turn the notifications on, because yesterday, today, and again tomorrow, the Let's Talk Tropics show is going to be kind of split into 2 versions, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. And then once we get into Friday, I'll get back to the live version that occurs at noon each and every day. And also don't forget, you can hear my weather forecast daily on Big 102.1, Planet Radio 106.7, and Freedom 95.1. And with radar updates and hurricane updates, you can get all of that on my social media pages, both on Facebook and X. I'm Meteorologist Dave Baker. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon, and I will talk to you on Acadiana Weather Today tomorrow morning around 7:30 right here on Acadiana Weather Today. See you then.